The text came at 5:47 a.m., and I know the exact time because I was already awake, standing in the bathroom of our rental house in Asheville, practicing my vows in the mirror like some nervous kid rehearsing a school speech 3 hours before the ceremony. My tie was draped over the towel rack. My shoes were polished and sitting by the door. I'd even trimmed my beard twice because the first pass left it uneven on the left side, and I wanted everything to be perfect. I wanted her to see me standing at the end of that aisle and know without question that I had prepared for this moment with everything I had. Then my phone buzzed on the counter, and the screen lit up with her name. "Mara, I can't do this. I'm sorry. Please don't call me." 9 words. That's what she used to dismantle 2 years of planning, 4 years of love, and every image I'd constructed of our future. 9 words at 5:47 in the morning, while the mountains outside the window were still wrapped in fog, and the caterers were probably already loading their van. I called her anyway, straight to voicemail. I called again, same result. I sent a message back calm, measured, the kind of response you write when your hands are shaking so badly the autocorrect can't keep up. "Can we please talk about this?" No reply. I called her sister, Danielle, who picked up on the 4th ring and said in a voice still thick with sleep, "She left an hour ago. She took her bag in the car. I don't know where she went." I sat down on the edge of the bathtub. The tile was cold through my dress pants. I remember that detail because it was the only thing I could feel the cold under my legs, and of this hollow, vacuumed silence in my chest where panic should have been, but wasn't. Not yet. It was like the news hadn't landed. It was circling above me, waiting for permission to crash. My best man, Theo, was staying in the room next door. I knocked on his door at 6:15. He opened it shirtless, half asleep, a toothbrush in his hand. He took one look at my face and said, "What happened?" "She's gone." He didn't ask who. He pulled me inside, sat me on the bed, and handed me a glass of water like I was a patient. Theo had been my closest friend since our freshman year at Chapel Hill. He was the one who'd introduced me to Mara at a mutual friend's barbecue. He was supposed to give a toast in 4 hours. Instead, he sat beside me in silence for a long time and then said, "Do you want me to start making calls?" I nodded. I couldn't do it. I couldn't be the one to tell 63 guests that the wedding was off. I couldn't call my mother, who had flown in from Sacramento and spent the previous evening crying happy tears over dinner. I couldn't face the florist or the officiant or the string duo we'd booked for the processional. So Theo did it. He sat in the corner of that dim room and made call after call while I stared at the ceiling and listened to him say the same thing in slightly different ways. "There's been a change of plans. The ceremony won't be happening today. We're sorry for the inconvenience." Inconvenience. That word buried itself in me like a splinter. By 8 o'clock, most of the guests had been notified. My mother called me directly, and I answered because I owed her that. She didn't cry. She just said, "Come home, sweetheart. Come home, and we'll figure it out." But I didn't want to go home. Home was the apartment in Charlotte that still smelled like Mara's shampoo, where the save-the-date magnets were still stuck to the refrigerator, where the guest bedroom had been converted into a staging area for wedding favors that would never be distributed. I told Theo I wanted to stay one more night. He agreed without hesitation. And that decision, staying in Asheville instead of driving back, is the reason I'm alive to tell you this. By mid-morning, the fog had burned off, and the mountains looked obscenely beautiful, green and golden. The sky so blue it seemed artificial. I hated every inch of it. The venue coordinator called to ask what she should do with the arch they'd already assembled, and I told her to take it apart. She asked about the deposit, and I said I didn't care. Theo handled the rest of the logistics, while I walked to the general store 3 blocks from the rental and bought a bottle of bourbon I had no intention of savoring. The store owner was a woman named Gail, mid-60s. Silver hair pulled into a braid, reading glasses perched on the end of her nose. She looked at my face while ringing up the bottle and said, "Rough morning. Wedding got canceled." She paused, looked at me over the glasses and said, "Hers or yours?" "Ours. She canceled it." Gail set the bottle in a paper bag and pushed it across the counter. "Well, the mountains don't care about your heartbreak, honey. But they're good company if you let them be." I almost laughed. I walked back to the rental house and found Theo sitting on the porch with 2 mugs of coffee. He'd also called Danielle again. Mara had texted her sister from somewhere near Knoxville. She was driving east. She hadn't explained anything, just said she needed space and not to follow her. "She's running," Theo said. Not with judgment, just observation. "From what?" "From you, from the commitment, from herself. Does it matter right now?" It didn't, but it would later. Everything Mara ran from would become irrelevant within 12 hours, though neither of us knew that yet. We spent the afternoon doing what men do when grief is too fresh to process. We drank slowly, watched baseball on the rental's ancient television, and avoided the subject with surgical precision. Theo told stories from work. He was an EMT in Raleigh, and his anecdotes were always a strange blend of harrowing and absurd. A woman who'd called 911 because her parrot swallowed a ring. A teenager who'd broken both wrists trying to skateboard down a church roof. We laughed, and the laughter tasted wrong, but it kept the silence from swallowing us. Around 4 in the afternoon, the television cut out mid-broadcast. Not static, just a black screen, followed by a tone I'd never heard before. Long, flat, mechanical. Then a scrolling banner appeared with the emergency alert system header. Theo sat up straight. The banner read, "CDC has issued a Level 4 biological threat advisory for Western North Carolina. Residents are advised to shelter in place. Avoid contact with individuals displaying erratic behavior, discolored skin, or unresponsiveness to verbal commands." This is not a test. I looked at Theo. He looked at me. Neither of us spoke for a long moment. "Erratic behavior," he repeated. "Discolored skin. What the hell is a Level 4 biological threat?" Theo stood and walked to the window. The street outside was quiet. The rental was on a residential lane about a mile from downtown Asheville, lined with old oaks and craftsman bungalows. Nothing looked wrong. A neighbor 2 houses down was watering his garden. A dog was barking somewhere up the hill. "Could be a chemical spill," Theo said. "Could be contamination from one of the plants near the river. They said biological, not chemical. Same protocol either way. Stay inside. Don't touch anyone." My phone buzzed. A push notification from a news app. Reports of violent incidents in Knoxville, Greenville, and Chattanooga. Hospitals overwhelmed. National Guard deployed to multiple locations. Knoxville. Mara had been heading toward Knoxville. I grabbed my phone and called her. Voicemail. I texted, "Mara, something is happening. Please tell me you're safe. Please." The message showed as delivered but not read. Theo was already pulling up local feeds on his phone. His face changed as he scrolled, not fear exactly, but recognition. As a paramedic, he'd seen emergencies cascade before. He understood the grammar of institutional panic. And whatever he was reading, the grammar was wrong. "They're closing I-40, he said quietly. "Both directions." The first one I saw was at dusk. The sun had dropped behind the ridgeline, and the sky was bleeding into that deep amber that makes the Blue Ridge look like something painted rather than real. I was standing on the porch, phone in hand, trying Mara for the 11th time, when movement at the end of the street caught my eye. A man was walking along the shoulder of the road. Walking isn't the right word. He was listing, tilting to one side like a boat taking on water. His left arm hanging at an angle that suggested the shoulder was dislocated, or worse. His shirt was torn open across the chest, and even from 60 yards away, I could see that his skin was wrong. Gray-purple, like a bruise that had spread across his entire torso. He wasn't making a sound. That's what I remember most. Complete silence from a body that was clearly in catastrophic distress. I stepped back from the porch railing. "Theo." He came to the door, looked where I was pointing, and went still. 5 seconds of assessment. That's all it took for his training to activate. "Go inside," he said. "Lock the back door. We should help him. Look at him, Marcus. Look at how he's moving. That's not a man who fell off a ladder." The figure reached the driveway of the house across the street and stopped. He didn't look around. He didn't call for help. He just stood there, swaying, his head canted at a steep angle, facing the front door of the neighbor's bungalow. Then he lunged forward, not running, but a sudden violent propulsion, and hit the door with his full body weight. The sound was like a car door slamming. He bounced off, staggered, and did it again. And again, as suckered. Each impact carried that same flat, toneless force. No screaming, no frustration, just repetitive, mechanical violence against a wooden door. The neighbor, the man who'd been watering his garden earlier, opened the door. I think he thought someone was hurt. I think he was trying to help. The gray figure grabbed him by the forearm and bit into the meat of his wrist. I saw it happen from 60 yards through the fading light, and even at that distance I could see the neighbor's mouth open into a scream I couldn't hear because my own blood was roaring in my ears. Theo pulled me inside and locked the front door. He moved through the house methodically, back door, windows, the sliding glass door in the kitchen that led to a small deck. He drew every curtain and blind. Then he turned off the lights. "Don't make noise," he said. "Don't turn anything on. If they respond to stimuli, we need to be invisible." "If who respond to stimuli? What is this?" Theo sat on the floor with his back against the kitchen island. In the dark, his face was unreadable. "I've seen a lot of things on the job. I've seen people on bath salts, PCP, ketamine psychosis. I've seen people in full neurological meltdown. That," he pointed toward the front of the house, "that wasn't any of those things. That man's motor function was degraded. His skin showed signs of systemic tissue death. And he was still moving, still aggressive. That's not a drug. That's not a psychotic break. Then what is it? I don't know. But I know what shelter in place means, and I know we need to take it seriously." My phone lit up. A text from my mother. "Are you watching the news? They're saying something is happening on the East Coast. Your father and I are staying inside. Please be safe. I love you." I typed back that I was safe, that I was with Theo, that I loved her too. Then I tried Mara again. Nothing. The sounds outside changed after dark. The quiet broke apart slowly. A distant car alarm. Then shouting from somewhere up the hill. Then a sound I can only describe as wet and rhythmic, like something heavy being dragged across asphalt. Theo and I sat in the dark kitchen and listened. Neither of us slept. Neither of us spoke about the wedding. The wedding had become irrelevant in a way that felt almost cosmically cruel, as though the universe had decided to answer my self-pity with something so enormous it made heartbreak look like a paper cut. By morning, the power was out. The lights had flickered around 2 a.m., surged once, and then died with a low electrical hum that faded into nothing. Theo had filled every container in the house with the water before that happened. Pots, glasses, the bathtub, a plastic storage bin he found in the hall closet. First thing that goes after power is water pressure, he said. Pumping stations need electricity. I hadn't thought of that. I hadn't thought of anything practical since the alert. My mind was still tethered to Mara, to the image of her driving toward Knoxville while something monstrous was blooming across the region like ink dropped into water. When the sun came up, I looked her through a gap in the living room curtains. The street was different. Not destroyed, not yet, but altered in a way that made my stomach clench. The neighbor's front door was open, hanging from one hinge. Dark smears marked the porch steps. The garden hose was still running, water pooling in the driveway and spilling into the gutter. No one was visible. No movement at all. The stillness was worse than the chaos of the night before because it implied that whatever had happened was finished. The violence had moved on, and this was what it left behind. Theo inventoried the kitchen. The rental had been stocked for a weekend, not a siege. We had half a loaf of bread, some deli meat, a bag of apples, cereal, a few cans of soup, peanut butter, and a box of crackers. Maybe 3 days of food if we rationed carefully. Water would last longer thanks to the bathtub. Theo laid everything out on the counter like a field surgeon organizing instruments and said, "We need to decide, stay or move." The alert said shelter in place. The alert was 12 hours ago. There's been nothing since. No update, no all clear, no sirens. If the infrastructure for emergency communication is down, that alert might be the last official guidance we ever get. I sat at the kitchen table and pressed my palms flat against the wood. The surface was cool and smooth, and I focused on that sensation because everything else felt like drowning. Where would we go? My truck's parked out front. Quarter tank of gas may be enough to get us 40 miles. If I-40 is blocked, we head south on the Blue Ridge Parkway. Find higher ground. Find a ranger station or a fire lookout with walls and a door. What about Mara? Theo looked at me. Not with pity, he wasn't that kind of friend. With patience. Marcus, you don't know where she is. You can't reach her. And we can't stay here based on the hope that she'll come back to a place she left voluntarily. He was right, and I hated him for it. Not truly, I could never truly hate Theo, but in that moment, his pragmatism felt like betrayal. Mara was somewhere out there, in a landscape that had turned predatory overnight. And the man who introduced us was telling me to drive in the opposite direction. A knock came at the back door. Both of us froze. The knock came again. 3 quick raps, human rhythm, deliberate pattern. Theo grabbed a kitchen knife and moved toward the door. He looked through the peephole and then exhaled. "It's a woman," he said. "She's holding a kid." He opened the door. She was mid-30s, dark hair plastered to her face with sweat, wearing a nurse's scrub top and jeans. The child in her arms was a boy, maybe 4 years old, face buried in her shoulder. She looked at Theo, then at me, and said, "Please, they're in the houses. They're going door to door." Her name was Priya. Her son's name was Kian. And their arrival changed the calculus of everything. Priya had been a night shift nurse at Mission Hospital. She'd been on duty when the first patients arrived, brought in by ambulance from a multi-vehicle pileup on I-26, where the drivers had exhibited what the paramedics called acute behavioral deterioration. She described it clinically, the way medical professionals do when the alternative is screaming. The patients were nonverbal, their pupils were fixed and dilated. Core body temperature was dropping despite visible agitation. 2 of them had bitten EMTs during transport. By midnight, those EMTs were showing the same symptoms. The hospital tried to isolate them, she said, sitting on the floor of the rental kitchen with Kian asleep across her lap. Quarantine protocol, negative pressure rooms, full PPE. It didn't matter. The infection, or whatever it is, doesn't follow containment logic. By 3 a.m., we had 37 affected patients and 12 affected staff. By 5, the hospital was gone. Gone how? Theo asked. Overrun. The affected patients broke containment. They moved through the wards. They weren't fast, but they didn't stop. Security tried to hold the main corridor, and I watched 3 of them get pulled down in less than a minute. I grabbed Kian from the daycare room. I'd brought him to work because my sitter canceled, and I went out through the loading dock. We've been walking since. She'd walked 4 miles in the dark with a 4-year-old in her arms, navigating by memory and moonlight, avoiding the main roads because she'd seen clusters of the infected gathered at intersections, as if drawn to the ambient noise of idling cars and blaring horns. She'd hidden behind a dumpster when a group of 6 passed within arm's reach, their bodies moving in that same lurching, tilted gait I'd witnessed from the porch. They don't hunt, she said. Not exactly. They respond to sound. Sharp, sudden sound. A door closing. A voice raised above a whisper. A car engine. They orient toward it and they pursue. But they lose interest if the source goes silent. Their attention span is degraded maybe 60 seconds of focused pursuit before they default back to wandering. Theo absorbed this like someone reading a technical manual. 60 seconds. That's useful. It's the only reason I'm alive. Kian stirred in his sleep. Priya adjusted him gently, her hand cupping the back of his head with a tenderness that made my throat tighten. This child had been carried through an apocalypse and was dreaming peacefully because his mother's arms were the only constant in a world that had shattered overnight. I looked at Theo. He looked at me. The unspoken calculation passed between us. 2 adults could move fast and quiet. 2 adults with a nurse and a small child could not. But turning them away was unthinkable not because of principle, though principle mattered, but because the moment Priya walked through that door, she became real. She wasn't a statistic or a headline. She was a woman whose hands were still steady despite everything she'd witnessed. And her son was asleep because he trusted her completely. We have food for 3 days, I said. Water for maybe 4. Theo's truck has a quarter tank. Priya nodded. The hospital pharmacy was raided before I left, but I grabbed what I could. She reached into the bag she'd been carrying, a children's backpack printed with cartoon dinosaurs, and pulled out a Ziploc bag filled with medical supplies. Bandages, antiseptic, a small suture kit, 3 courses of broad-spectrum antibiotics, ibuprofen, and a bottle of children's acetaminophen. It's not much, but if someone gets hurt, it's the difference between recovery and sepsis. You carried that and a child for 4 miles, Theo said. I'm a nurse. We carry everything. Something shifted in the room. The despair that had been sitting on my chest since Mara's text message loosened slightly, not because the situation had improved, but because the dynamic had changed. I was no longer a man mourning a canceled wedding while the world burned. I was part of something, a group, a unit, and units survive differently than individuals. Theo unfolded a road map he'd found in the junk drawer. South, he said. The parkway. High ground, low population density. We leave at dusk when their visual acuity might be reduced. Priya looked at the map and placed her finger on a point 30 miles south. There's a fire station near Brevard. Concrete walls, generator, radio equipment. If anyone's coordinating a response, they'll use infrastructure like that. It was the first plan that felt real. The first thing that pointed forward instead of backward. We spent the day preparing. Theo drained the bathtub water into every sealable container we could find. 2-liter soda bottles from recycling, Ziploc bags doubled up, a thermos, a water bladder from a hiking pack someone had left in the closet. Priya organized the food into calorie-dense packages and discarded anything that would spoil quickly. I was assigned the physical task, reinforcing the truck. Theo's pickup was a 10-year-old Toyota Tacoma, dark green, the bed covered with a hard tonneau shell. I loaded it with blankets from the rental, the food containers, the medical supplies, and a toolbox from the garage that contained a hammer, a crowbar, a box of nails, duct tape, and a flashlight with batteries that still worked. I moved slowly and quietly, keeping my head below the fence line, listening for sounds that didn't belong. The street remained empty, but the emptiness had texture now, a charged, expectant quality, like the air before a thunderstorm. While I worked, I found myself thinking about Mara, despite every effort not to. Not about the canceled wedding that wound was still too raw to probe, but about her safety. She'd been heading toward Knoxville, which was one of the cities mentioned in the initial news alert. If the hospital in Asheville had fallen by 5 a.m., Knoxville could have been worse. Larger city, larger population, more vectors for transmission. I imagined her stuck on a blocked highway, surrounded by abandoned cars, the infection closing in from both directions. The image was so vivid it made me physically sick. I bent over the side of the truck and dry heaved into the grass. "You all right?" Theo had come out the back door, moving soundlessly the way he'd started to do, as if silence were now a permanent condition. "No. I know. But you need to be functional. Can you do that?" "I can do that." He clapped me on the shoulder once and went back inside. That was Theo's emotional vocabulary brief, physical and honest. No speeches, no platitudes. Just a hand on your shoulder and the implicit promise that he wouldn't leave you behind. At 4 p.m., Priya woke Kian and fed him crackers and peanut butter. The boy was remarkably calm, quiet, observant, with large dark eyes that tracked everything in the room without fear. He asked his mother one question. "Are we going on a trip?" She said yes. He said okay and went back to eating. Children accept new realities faster than adults because they haven't yet learned that reality is supposed to be stable. I watched them together, Priya wiping crumbs from his chin. Kian handing her a cracker he'd decided was too broken and felt a pull in my chest that wasn't grief. It was responsibility. Somewhere in the last 12 hours, the framework of my life had been stripped to studs. And now new weight was being hung on the structure. Not the weight I'd chosen, not the future I'd planned, but weight that mattered. At 5:30, Theo gathered us in the kitchen. He'd drawn a route on the road map with a pen borrowed from the rental's junk drawer. We take Hendersonville Road south out of town. Avoid the interstates entirely. Stay on secondary roads. The parkway entrance is about 15 miles from here. From there, it's another 15 to the fire station Priya mentioned. 30 miles on a quarter tank, I said. The Tacoma gets decent mileage on flat terrain. The parkway has elevation changes, But if I keep it under 40, we should make it. And if we don't, then we walk. But we walk together, and we walk prepared. Priya strapped Kian into the back seat of the truck, using a seatbelt and a rolled blanket as a makeshift booster. She sat beside him. Theo drove. I rode passenger with the crowbar across my knees and the window cracked half an inch so I could hear what was coming. The engine sounded obscenely loud in the silence of the dead neighborhood. We pulled out of the driveway at 6:12 p.m. The sun was lowering. The street was empty. And behind us, in the rearview mirror, I saw something move in the doorway of the house across the street, a shape, gray and tilted, watching us leave with eyes that didn't blink. Theo pressed the accelerator gently, and we left Asheville behind. Neither of us looked back again. The first 5 miles were a graveyard of normalcy. We passed a gas station with its lights still on. The generator must have been running. But the lot was empty, the pumps unattended, the convenience store doors standing wide open with a rack of sunglasses toppled across the threshold. A school bus sat diagonally across both lanes a mile further, its stop sign still extended, no driver visible. Theo navigated around it on the shoulder without slowing, and I caught a glimpse of backpacks scattered on the bus floor through the windows. Small backpacks, bright colors. I turned away. Kian fell asleep again within minutes. The hum of the engine and the gentle rocking of the truck worked on him like a lullaby. And Priya let his head rest against her arm while she watched the passing landscape with the controlled vigilance of someone who'd been trained to monitor vital signs. Every few seconds, her eyes moved from the road ahead to the tree line on the left, to the rearview mirror, to her son and back again. A circuit, automatic and relentless. Hendersonville Road took us through a stretch of suburban sprawl that looked untouched if you didn't study it closely. Houses with manicured lawns, cars in driveways, an American flag hanging limp from a porch pole. But there were details that cracked the illusion. A front door ajar here. A window shattered there, a dark stain on a sidewalk that could have been motor oil, but wasn't. The infection had passed through this area like a selective wind, taking some and leaving others, and the survivors, if there were survivors, had gone quiet. How does it spread? I asked Priya, keeping my voice low. Fluid transfer, primarily through bites, but any open wound exposed to their saliva or blood would theoretically be sufficient. Incubation was fast. The patient's admission went from bite to full conversion in under 4 hours, some faster. Conversion? The clinical word sat ugly in the air. I don't have a better term. They stop being who they were. Higher brain function collapses. They retain motor capability and aggression. But personality, memory, speech, it's all gone. The person dies. The body keeps operating. Theo spoke without taking his eyes from the road. Is there a treatment? Not that I saw. We tried antivirals, broad-spectrum antibiotics, sedation. Nothing reversed the neurological degradation. Once it reaches the brainstem, the patient is functionally gone. What remains is a biological machine running on the most primitive neural pathways: threat detection, pursuit, feeding. The word feeding hung in the cab like smoke. Kian shifted in his sleep, murmured something inaudible, and settled. We reached the Blue Ridge Parkway entrance 20 minutes later. The gate was closed but unmanned, and Theo drove through the wooden barrier arm without stopping. It snapped against the hood and tumbled into the ditch. The parkway opened ahead of us, a 2-lane ribbon of asphalt curving along the spine of the mountains. No guardrails in places. the drop on the western side plunging hundreds of feet into forested valleys already filling with evening shadow. There were cars on the parkway. Not many, maybe a dozen in the first few miles, but all of them were stopped. Some were pulled to the side as if their drivers had parked deliberately. Others were angled across the road, doors open, engines off. We weaved through them slowly, and I forced myself to look inside each one as we passed. Most were empty. One contained a woman slumped against the steering wheel, motionless, her face turned away. I couldn't tell if she was dead or converted or simply unconscious, and we didn't stop to find out. "We can't stop for anyone," Theo said, as if reading my thoughts. "Not until we reach the fire station." "I know." "I need to hear you say you understand why." "Because we have a child in the truck. Because we don't know who's infected. Because stopping could kill us." Yeah. I understood, but understanding didn't make it easier. Each car we passed was a story I'd never know, a family that didn't make it, a decision that went wrong, a 60-second delay that cost everything. The parkway was beautiful and merciless, and the sunset turning the sky to copper and rose was the cruelest backdrop imaginable for what the road had become. The fire station appeared around a bend 12 miles south of the parkway entrance, set back from the road in a clearing surrounded by hemlock trees. It was exactly what Priya had described: a single-story concrete structure with a metal roof, 2 bay doors for trucks, and a communications tower rising from the back corner. The bay doors were closed, no lights visible, no vehicles in the lot. Theo parked 50 yards from the front entrance and cut the engine. We sat in silence for a full minute, listening. Wind in the hemlocks. A bird, something nocturnal, calling from the ridge above. Nothing else. "I'll go first," Theo said. "Marcus, you stay with the truck. Engine off. If I'm not back in 5 minutes, drive south and don't look back." "I'm not leaving you." "You're not leaving me. You're protecting them." He glanced at the back seat where Priya was watching us both, Kian still sleeping against her side. Theo took the crowbar and moved toward the building. I watched him cross the parking lot in a low, purposeful stride, not running, not creeping, just steady and aware. He reached the front door, tested the handle, and it opened. He disappeared inside. The 5 minutes that followed were among the longest of my life. I sat in that truck with my hand on the ignition, ready to turn it, praying I wouldn't need to. Priya didn't speak. She'd placed one hand on Kian's chest, monitoring his breathing the way she probably monitored patients, by touch, by rhythm, by the subtle language of a body at rest. At the 4-minute mark, a light appeared inside the station, a flashlight beam sweeping across the windows. Then Theo's silhouette appeared at the door, and he waved us forward. The interior was austere and functional. A main bay with space for 2 trucks, both gone, presumably deployed somewhere, a back office with a desk and radio equipment. A small kitchen with a propane stove and running water from a gravity-fed tank, and a bunk room with 4 cots. There was a generator in a utility closet, diesel-powered, with half a tank of fuel. Theo had already started it, and the hum of electricity felt like civilization returning in miniature. "Radio's intact," Theo said, leading me into the back office. The equipment was older. A base station with a handheld microphone, frequency knobs, and a speaker mounted on the wall. He turned it on and began scanning channels. Static, static, more static. Then, on a frequency marked EMER-7, a voice. It was faint, broken by interference, but unmistakably human. A man, speaking in clipped, exhausted sentences. Pisgah Ranger Station. 17 survivors. Perimeter holding, but supplies critical. Request any available assistance. Broadcasting on this frequency every hour. Pisgah. That was the national forest south of us, maybe 20 miles by road. 17 survivors, Priya said from the doorway. That's a group. That's infrastructure. That's also 17 mouths, Theo said. And a perimeter that's holding, which means it's under pressure. He said they need help. We have medical supplies. I have training. The logic was sound, but the risk was real. 20 more miles through unknown territory in a truck that was running on fumes toward a location that was actively being threatened. Theo looked at me, and I understood that he was giving me the deciding vote. Not because he was deferring to my judgment, but because this was a choice that had to be shared. I thought about Mara. I thought about how she'd made a unilateral decision that morning, a choice that affected both of us, made alone, without discussion. I thought about how that felt, and I decided I would never do it to the people in this room. We rest tonight, I said. Full sleep rotation. Eat, hydrate, recover. At dawn, we try to raise Pisgah on the radio and get more information. Then we decide together. Theo nodded. Priya nodded. Even Kian, who'd woken during the radio transmission, nodded, not because he understood, but because the adults around him were agreeing. An agreement felt safe. We ate canned soup heated on the propane stove. We distributed cots. Theo took first watch. I lay on a thin mattress in a fire station bunk room somewhere in the mountains of North Carolina and stared at the ceiling and thought, this is my life now. This is what comes after the wedding that didn't happen. This is the after. I dreamed of Mara. Not the version of her who sent that text, the other one, the earlier one. The woman who laughed at my terrible jokes and fell asleep on my chest during movies, and once drove 45 minutes in a rainstorm to bring me soup when I had the flu. The version of her I built a future around. She was standing in a field I didn't recognize, facing away from me. And no matter how loudly I called her name, she didn't turn. She just stood there in the tall grass while the sky above her darkened from amber to black. Theo shook me awake at 3 a.m. for my watch shift. His face was drawn, the lines around his eyes deeper than they'd been that morning. Even Theo unflappable, procedural. Theo was showing the strain. He handed me the flashlight and a bottle of water and said, "Nothing on the perimeter. Wind picked up about an hour ago. I heard movement in the tree line around midnight. But it could have been deer. Could have been. Stay away from the windows. Check the radio at 4. He collapsed onto the cot I'd vacated, and within 2 minutes, his breathing had settled into the deep, regular rhythm of practiced exhaustion. EMTs learned to sleep like soldiers, fast, complete, and without preamble. I sat in the back office with the flashlight off, listening to the building breathe. Fire stations are built for durability, not comfort. The walls were thick concrete, the windows small and high. It felt like a bunker, and maybe that was exactly what we needed. I checked the radio at 4 as instructed. The Pisgah broadcast repeated, nearly identical to the earlier one. With one addition, the speaker mentioned that 2 members of their group were injured and that their medical knowledge was limited to basic first aid. I thought about Priya in the bunk room, her medical bag tucked under her cot like a soldier's rifle. She'd carried it through the collapse of a hospital, through 4 miles of darkness, through fear so absolute it could have turned her to stone. She carried it because she was a healer, and healers don't stop being healers when the world stops making sense. If we reached Pisgah, she could help those people. If we stayed here, she'd be a nurse with no patients in a concrete box, waiting for supplies to run out. But the decision wasn't mine alone. I'd promised that. At dawn, Priya was already awake, heating water on the propane stove for Kian's oatmeal. The boy sat at the kitchen table, swinging his legs, drawing on a piece of paper he'd found in the office. He was drawing trees, tall ones with wide canopies, the kind that lined the parkway. No monsters, no fire, just trees. I watched him draw for a moment and felt something fracture inside my chest, not break, but shift, like tectonic plates adjusting to a new configuration. I checked the radio, I told Priya. Pisgah repeated their broadcast. They have injured people. They mentioned limited medical capacity. She didn't hesitate. Then we should go. It's 20 miles. The truck might not make it. Then we drive as far as we can and walk the rest. Theo appeared in the kitchen doorway, running a hand over his face. I heard. She's right. You said 17 mouths. I did. I also said the perimeter's under pressure, which means they have fighters. And fighters with a nurse are more effective than fighters without one. We bring value to that group, Marcus. We're not refugees. We're reinforcements. It was the first time since the outbreak that anyone had framed our situation in terms of what we could offer, rather than what we'd lost. The reorientation was subtle, but powerful. We weren't victims fleeing a disaster. We were people with skills moving toward purpose. We packed the truck in 30 minutes. Theo drained the fire station's gravity tank into our containers, giving us another 2 days of water. I took the fire station's first aid kit, redundant with Priya's supplies, but worth the wait. Priya found a hand crank radio in the office and added it to our inventory. Kian carried his drawing, folded neatly and tucked into his pocket like a talisman. We left the fire station at 7:15 a.m. under a sky that was cloudless and wide and completely indifferent to the catastrophe unfolding beneath it. We ran out of gas 11 miles from the ranger station. The engine coughed twice and died on a gentle uphill grade. And Theo coasted the truck to the shoulder with the kind of calm that comes from having exhausted all surprise. He put it in park, set the brake, and said, "On foot from here." 9 miles, with a 4-year-old, through terrain that could be hiding anything. Priya pulled Kian onto her hip without complaint, but I could see the strain in her shoulders immediately. The boy wasn't heavy, but 9 miles of mountain road while carrying 30 pounds of child and a pack of medical supplies would break anyone. I took the pack from her. Theo carried the water and the food. We walked in single file, Theo leading, Priya in the middle, me at the rear with a crowbar, and we stayed close to the tree line so we could disappear into the woods at the first sign of trouble. The first 2 miles were quiet. The parkway curved through dense forest, the trees closing overhead like a cathedral nave, sunlight filtering through in broken columns. Our footsteps were the only sound. Kian rested his head on Priya's shoulder and watched the forest pass with his wide, cataloging eyes. He pointed at a hawk circling above the canopy and whispered, "Bird." Priya whispered back, "Red-tailed hawk?" He repeated it silently, mouthing the words, storing them. At mile 3, we found the blockade. Someone had dragged fallen trees across the road, not naturally fallen, but cut. Chainsaw cuts visible in the pale wood. Behind the trees, a pickup truck was parked sideways, and behind the truck stood 2 men with hunting rifles. "Stop where you are," one of them called. He was tall, bearded, wearing a camouflage jacket and a baseball cap with a faded logo. His rifle was pointed at the ground, but angled toward us in a way that communicated readiness. The second man was shorter, stockier, with a shotgun braced against his hip. Theo raised both hands, palms out. We're not infected. We heard the broadcast from Pisgah. We're trying to reach the ranger station. A lot of people trying to reach the ranger station, the bearded man said. Not all of them made it. We have a nurse, I said, stepping forward, and medical supplies. Your broadcast mentioned injured people. The two men exchanged a look. The shorter one lowered his shotgun slightly. You're not bitten? None of you? No. The kid? He's clean, Priya said, her voice carrying the same authority she probably used in triage. I've been monitoring all of us. No fever, no discoloration, no behavioral changes. The bearded man studied us for a long moment. Then he whistled a sharp, two-note signal, and from the woods on either side of the road, two more people emerged. A woman in her 20s with a crossbow and a man carrying a fire axe. The outer perimeter. We'd been covered from 4 angles the entire time. I'm Dale, the bearded man said. This is my brother Curtis. You follow us, you stay quiet, and if I tell you to run, you run without asking why. Clear? Clear. They led us through a gap in the tree barricade and down a gravel access road that wound through old-growth forest for half a mile, before opening into a clearing. The Pisgah Ranger Station sat at the center, a solid 2-story timber and stone building with a wraparound porch, a satellite dish on the roof, and a parking area that held 4 vehicles and a small fleet of ATVs. A hand-painted sign on the porch read, Pisgah Outpost. 17 souls do not enter without escort. 17. The same number from the broadcast. That meant no one new had arrived and no one had been lost. Both facts were meaningful. Dale led us onto the porch where a woman was waiting. She was in her 50s, lean and weathered, with close cropped gray hair and eyes that assessed us with the efficiency of someone accustomed to making fast decisions about people. I'm Nora, she said. I run this station. Was a park ranger for 22 years before all this. She looked at Priya. You're a nurse? ICU, an emergency. Nora's expression didn't change, but something in her posture released a tension she'd been carrying for days, loosened by 2 syllables. We have 2 people who need you. One's got a deep laceration on his forearm that's threatening to go septic. The other took a fall and I think her wrist is broken. Can you help? Show me. Priya handed Kian to me the first time she'd done so and followed Nora inside. Kian looked up at me with his enormous eyes and said very quietly, Is this where we live now? I adjusted him on my hip and looked at the ranger station, at the mountains behind it, at the people moving with purpose across the clearing. For now, I said. Yeah, for now. The ranger station operated on a structure that Nora had implemented within hours of the outbreak reaching the park. Roles were assigned based on capability. Dale and Curtis managed perimeter security with a rotation of 4 watchers in 6-hour shifts. A retired electrician named Warren maintained the generator and the radio equipment. A couple in their 30s, Lena and James, handled food preparation and water purification using a filtration system they'd built from camping supplies and activated charcoal. Everyone contributed. Everyone had a function. It wasn't democracy and it wasn't dictatorship, it was triage governance. And Nora ran it with the same quiet competence she'd probably brought to managing a ranger district. Priya went to work immediately. The man with the laceration was a hiker named Dev, who'd cut his arm on a jagged piece of metal while reinforcing the barricade 3 days earlier. The wound was red and swollen, the skin around it hot to the touch. Priya cleaned it, applied antiseptic, sutured the deepest section, and started him on the antibiotics she'd carried from Mission Hospital. You're lucky, she told him. Another day, and I'd have been talking about amputation. Dev, a lanky, soft-spoken man in his late 20s with wire-rimmed glasses and a nervous habit of pushing them up his nose, looked at her with something close to reverence. "I've been pouring vodka on it. That's not entirely useless, but please stop." The woman with the broken wrist was Alma, one of the perimeter watchers, a former high school teacher who'd been hiking the Appalachian Trail when the outbreak began. Priya splinted the wrist using materials from the fire station first aid kit, immobilized it with a sling fashioned from a pillowcase, and gave Alma a strict lecture about not using it for at least 4 weeks. 4 weeks? Alma said. We're in the middle of an apocalypse. Your wrist doesn't care about the apocalypse. If it heals wrong, you lose function permanently. Find someone else for watch duty and let your bones knit. Watching Priya work was like watching someone return to themselves. The fear and exhaustion that had marked her face since she'd knocked on our door in Asheville fell away, replaced by focus, competence, and the specific kind of authority that comes from knowing you are doing exactly what you were built to do. Kian sat in the corner of the medical area, a repurposed storage room, and drew pictures while his mother saved lives. He drew the ranger station. He drew the mountains. He drew Theo, recognizable by the broad shoulders and the serious expression Kian had captured with startling accuracy. Theo integrated himself into the security rotation within hours. Dale was suspicious of newcomers by nature, but Theo's EMT background and his calm under pressure earned respect quickly. By that evening, he was walking the perimeter with Curtis, learning the approach routes and the patterns of infected movement that the group had mapped over the previous days. They come in waves. Curtis told us over dinner, canned chili heated on the propane stove, eaten in the station's main room by lantern light. Not organized, more like migration. A cluster will move through an area, and you'll get 10 or 15 of them passing within a quarter mile over the span of an hour. Then nothing for half a day. Then another cluster. They follow roads, Dale added. Water sources, too. The creek that runs along the eastern boundary has been a consistent corridor. We blocked it with deadfall, but they push through eventually. How many have you had to deal with directly? I asked. Dale and Curtis exchanged a look that carried weight. 11, Dale said, since we established the perimeter, all at close range, all when they breached the barricade. How do you stop them? Destroy the brainstem. Nothing else works reliably. You can break their legs, and they'll crawl. You can take an arm, and they'll keep coming with the other. But if you sever the connection between the brain and the body, they drop. It's the only guaranteed method. The room was quiet after that. 17 people eating chili by lantern light, absorbing the operational reality of killing things that used to be human. I looked around the table at Dale's hardened resolve, at Nora's measured calm, at Dev nervously adjusting his glasses, at Lena pressing her shoulder against James's arm for comfort, at Priya feeding Kian small spoonfuls and wiping his chin, at Theo studying the room the way he studied everything, with complete and relentless attention. This was my community now, assembled by catastrophe, held together by structure and necessity, and more fragile than any of us wanted to admit. On the third day at Pisgah, the moral fracture came. Not from outside, from within. A man stumbled into the clearing at midday, alone, on foot, waving his arms above his head. Dale and Curtis intercepted him at the barricade. He was mid-40s, heavy-set, wearing a business suit that was torn at the knees and streaked with dirt. He said his name was Frank Oberlin, that he'd been driving from Atlanta to D.C. for a meeting when the highways closed, and that he'd been walking for 2 days after his car ran out of gas on the parkway. Nora conducted the intake assessment. No bites, no discoloration, no fever. His vitals were normal. He was dehydrated and exhausted, but otherwise healthy. He was given water and food and a cot in the bunk room. The problem surfaced that evening. During dinner, Frank started talking about resources, not sharing them, controlling them. He pointed out that the group had no long-term food plan, that the generator fuel would run out within a week, and that the perimeter was vulnerable from the north. All valid observations. Then he said, "What you need is centralized leadership. One person making decisions, allocating resources, directing labor. This collaborative approach is going to get people killed." Nora set down her fork. "We have centralized leadership. It's me. With respect, you're a park ranger. This is a survival scenario. It requires someone with executive experience." The silence that followed had edges. Dale's hand moved to the knife on his belt, an unconscious gesture, purely reflexive. But I noticed it, and so did Theo. "Mr. Oberlin," Nora said, "you've been here 6 hours. In that time, you've consumed our food, used our water, and occupied a cot that could go to someone who's been watching the perimeter for days. I'm grateful you're safe. But leadership isn't claimed. It's earned. And right now, you haven't earned anything." Frank leaned back in his chair. He smiled the tight, controlled smile of a man who was accustomed to getting his way and was simply recalculating the approach. "Of course, I understand. I'll contribute however I can." But I watched his eyes scan the room, measuring each person, assessing alliances and vulnerabilities the way a predator maps terrain. Theo saw it too. After dinner, he pulled me aside on the porch and said, "That man is more dangerous than anything in the woods. He just got here." "Exactly. And he's already positioning. Give him 3 days, and he'll have half this group convinced that Nora's incompetent. Give him a week, and he'll have created a faction." So what do? We watch him. We don't let him isolate anyone. And if he makes a move, we back Nora without hesitation. It happened faster than Theo predicted. By the next morning, Frank had volunteered for the kitchen rotation and was working alongside Lena and James, who were friendly by nature and receptive to his charm. By noon, he'd suggested to Warren that the generator schedule was inefficient and proposed modifications that, while technically sound, put him in control of when and how power was distributed. By dinner, he'd befriended Dev, who was still recovering from his wound and susceptible to attention, and had begun suggesting that the perimeter strategy was too aggressive and that resources spent on defense should be redirected to comfort. It was textbook, not malicious in the way that violence is malicious, subtle, structural, the kind of power accumulation that happens in boardrooms and political campaigns. Frank wasn't trying to overthrow Nora. He was trying to make himself indispensable while making her seem optional. I found Nora on the porch that evening, looking at the darkening tree line. She was holding a mug of tea that had gone cold. "You see what he's doing," I said. "I've been a woman in a government agency for 22 years, Marcus. I've been seeing men like Frank Oberlin my entire career. So, what's the plan?" She took a sip of cold tea and grimaced. "The plan is to let him overextend. People like Frank can't help themselves. They push until they push too far, and then the group sees them clearly. My job is to keep everyone alive until that happens." She was right, but the timeline was compressed. In the old world, Frank's power play would have unfolded over months. Here, where every day felt like a year, the reckoning would come much sooner. The reckoning arrived on our 5th day at Pisgah, and it arrived in the worst possible way during a breach. At 4 a.m., the northern barricade failed. A cluster of infected larger than any previous wave, maybe 30 or more, pushed through the deadfall along the creek and reached the clearing. Alma, who disobeyed Priya's medical orders and was back on watch despite her broken wrist, fired the signal flare that woke the station. The red light arced over the trees and hung in the sky like a burning eye. Everyone mobilized. Dale and Curtis took point with their rifles. Theo and 2 others formed a secondary line with axes and tools. Nora directed people to defensive positions with commands that were sharp and precise. Priya grabbed Kian, her medical bag, and moved to the interior safe room, a reinforced closet that the group had prepared for exactly this scenario. Frank froze. I saw it happen. He stood in the main room, fully dressed. He'd been awake, which raised its own questions, and he did not move. His face went slack. His hands trembled. The executive composure that had carried him through days of political maneuvering evaporated the instant the threat became physical and immediate. He was not a leader in crisis. He was a man who had spent his life managing abstract power and had never once faced anything that could kill him. "Frank," Nora shouted, "get to the barricade or get to the safe room. Do one or the other." He didn't respond. He stood there, blocking the hallway, while people tried to move past him. Dev, gentle, nervous Dev with his sutured arm and his wire-rimmed glasses, pushed past Frank without a word, grabbed a fire axe from the wall mount, and ran toward the northern line. I followed Dev. The clearing was chaos in the pre-dawn dark flashlight beams cutting through fog, the sound of bodies hitting the barricade, Dale's rifle cracking in controlled bursts. The infected were pressing against the reinforced fence line. A mass of gray limbs and open mouths, soundless except for the wet friction of their bodies against wood and wire. The silence was the worst part. 30 beings engaged in relentless assault, and none of them made a sound. Curtis's shotgun boomed. 2 infected dropped. 3 more filled the gap. Theo was at the fence with a splitting maul, driving the bladed head through the wire mesh into the skulls of those pressing closest. His movements were mechanical, efficient, and utterly devoid of hesitation. This was a man who had held dying people in ambulances, who had performed CPR on children, who understood that survival and compassion are not always compatible. I took position beside him with a crowbar and did what needed to be done. I won't describe it in detail because the detail isn't the point. The point is that in the moments when the barricade bowed inward and the bodies pressed through and the flashlight caught the faces of things that had once been people, a woman in a jogging outfit, a teenager in a varsity jacket, an old man still wearing a hospital gown, I did not stop. I swung and I aimed and I followed the instruction Dale had given. Destroy the brainstem. And each time one fell, another appeared. And each time I wanted to scream but didn't because sound was the enemy and discipline was the only weapon that wouldn't run out. The breach lasted 19 minutes. Afterward, Dale counted 23 bodies on the north line. No defenders were bitten. Dev had acquitted himself with startling courage, holding a section of fence alone for nearly 2 minutes when Curtis had to reload. Alma had fired 4 crossbow bolts from an elevated position with her one good hand, and 3 of them found their mark. Frank was found in the bunk room, sitting on his cot, staring at the wall. No one spoke to him. No one needed to. The group had seen what he was in the moment it mattered, and no amount of strategic maneuvering could unsee it. By noon, Frank had packed his bag and asked to leave. Nora gave him food, water, and a map, and Dale escorted him to the barricade. He walked down the gravel road and disappeared into the forest, and I never learned what happened to him. 3 weeks passed. I know that sounds like a jump, but those weeks were not empty. They were the densest, most exhausting, most clarifying days of my life, compressed into a rhythm of labor, vigilance, and the slow, painful process of becoming someone new. The perimeter was rebuilt and doubled. Theo designed a secondary barrier system using materials salvaged from a hardware store 8 miles north. A run that took 4 people and an ATV and nearly ended in disaster when they encountered a cluster at a crossroads. They made it back, and the new defenses held. The northern approach was reinforced with a trench system that Curtis dug over 6 days with the help of anyone who could hold a shovel. Priya established a medical protocol that extended beyond wound care. She implemented hygiene standards, water testing procedures, and a daily health check for every member of the group. She trained Dev and Lena in basic emergency care wound cleaning, splinting, CPR, so that medical knowledge wasn't concentrated in a single person. Her systematic approach reduced the anxiety that had been simmering since the outbreak, because structure and information are the most effective antidotes to fear. Kian adapted with the terrifying ease of childhood. He had chores, small ones, age-appropriate, like sorting kindling and drawing the daily weather on a piece of paper taped to the kitchen wall. He called Theo Mr. Theo and followed him around the station with the devotion of a shadow. He called me Marcus without the Mr. And I never corrected him because the informality felt like trust. I thought about Mara every day, not with the raw, bleeding intensity of the first morning, but with something quieter, a low, steady ache that lived in the background of everything I did. I stopped calling her phone when the cell networks went dead on day 4. I stopped imagining rescue scenarios when the radio broadcasts from outside the region ceased entirely on day 10. I didn't give up hope. Hope isn't something you choose to abandon, but I let it change shape. It went from, I will find her, to, I hope she found safety, to, eventually, I hope she is at peace, wherever and however that manifests. The person I had been, the man practicing vows in a bathroom mirror, was gone. Not dead, composted, broken down, and transformed into raw material for someone different. That new person stood watch at 3 a.m. and felt not fear, but focus. That new person rationed food without resentment and shared water without calculation. That new person held Kian on his hip during thunderstorms and told him stories about the mountains until the boy fell asleep, and somewhere in the telling found that the stories mattered to him too. One evening, Nora sat beside me on the porch. The fireflies were out, millions of them, pulsing in the darkness like the valley was breathing light. She handed me a mug of something warm and herbal that Warren had brewed from plants Alma identified on the ridge. "You're different from when you arrived," she said. "Everyone's different. Not like you. You arrived broken. You're not broken anymore." I looked at the fireflies. "I don't feel unbroken." "That's because you're confusing healed with unbroken. They're not the same thing. You healed around the fracture. The break is still there. But you function. You contribute. You protect people who need protecting. That's not unbroken. That's stronger." I drank the tea. It tasted like pine and earth and something faintly sweet. Theo was on the perimeter, a flashlight beam moving in slow arcs through the tree line. Priya was inside, reading to Kian from a field guide she'd found in the station's library. He was obsessed with identifying tree species and could now name 12 by their leaves alone. This was my life. Not the one I'd planned. Not the one I'd rehearsed in a bathroom mirror at 5:47 a.m. on what was supposed to be the best day of my existence. This life was harder, stranger, more frightening. and more honest than anything I had ever imagined. And standing on that porch with fireflies blinking in the dark and the sound of a child reciting the names of trees drifting through the open window, I understood something I couldn't have learned any other way. The life you plan is not the life that shapes you. The life that shapes you is the one that arrives uninvited, strips you to the foundation, and forces you to build again with whatever materials remain. I was still building. We all were. And the mountains held us while we worked. The broadcast went out every morning at dawn. Theo's voice on the radio, steady and clear, repeating coordinates and a simple message. Pisgah Outpost. 23 survivors. Perimeter secure. Medical capability on site. If you can hear this, you are not alone. 23. We'd grown. More would come. The infected still moved through the valleys in their silent, relentless waves. And the barricades still shuddered in the dark. And every sunrise was earned, rather than given. But we were there. Functioning, protecting. Building something that didn't have a name yet, but had a shape the shape of people choosing over and over to stay together when everything outside was designed to drive them apart. I kept Mara's last text saved on a phone with a dead battery, tucked in the bottom of my pack. Not as a wound, as a waypoint. The last marker of the person I used to be, preserved so the person I'd become could remember where the road turned. Some mornings I stood at the edge of the clearing and watched the fog lift from the ridgeline and thought, I survived. Not just the outbreak, not just the breach. I survived the end of a life I thought I needed. And I found, in the wreckage, a life that needed me. The mountains don't care about your heartbreak, but they are good company if you let them be.